in my case, would be wrong, because what my work is about is, of course, how do you make a building for a minority that has been so decimated and so, you know, I mean, killed and so on in this country. How do you do that? And how was it even from 1850 onward in that country to be able to make a house for a minority that was not in high regard at all? So, but we're not onto that. So what I will do is I'll talk about some other thing that was not in high regard either. And I think that this might surprise you, but I feel that the Bauhaus, you see, or not I feel, it's fact. The Bauhaus was also an outsider school. It was a location that was battered and was closed. And I want to kind of give an account of that in my first part, because I felt that it has to do with this idea of blossoming landscapes. Here you see, I don't know if you know this guy. He is our version, our past version of now Bibi Netanyahu. You know, he used to be the Prime Minister, the Chancellor. And he came to, when the wall fell in 1990, he promised the East German part of the country in order to absorb that country. He was also interested in getting new land, as you can see. He would then say, I promise you blossoming landscapes. And that's why this lecture is called like that. And let me see what I can do with that. We had, 2 years ago, we had a big conference in Dessau, 10 years architectural education at DIA. We had run our program for 10 years. And after that, we invited a lot of people for 2 days to talk about design education as a research laboratory. And this, of course, has also its connotations to the Bauhaus. Here you see this building. It's built opened in 1926, after the first time that the Bauhaus was kicked out from somewhere. The Bauhaus started in 1919 under Henry van der Velde in Weimar, and they had a very right-wing parliament in that city, which by 1921 asked everybody to just get out. They didn't want that. So the Dessau mayor was interested to catch this Bauhaus institution. It talked to Gropius, and Gropius then said, okay, I'll come. And he also built the building. And I suppose you know this building. And if you make a conference, can you hear me? Otherwise,
no, it's okay. Just
yeah? Don't need one. But anyway, as this is the original inside of one of those classrooms, and they're not classrooms, they are really workshops. And that's why the question of a design laboratory, which I believe this was, is interesting. Now, I will show this. This is the student house, the so-called Proller house. That's where students used to live in that building. And this is the Mensa, connecting to the main building where you would eat. And then, of course, you have two main protagonists who you know. And my argument is that you need as a basis for design, you need a kind of creative milieu in a place. And I think this is maybe the biggest asset that the Bauhaus had, that it had these teachers that came together, that formulated a certain idea of how to teach people, and that they were no longer interested in this sort of ornament and so on, but were interested in providing a design for an industrial society with a workforce that was, you know, a proletarian workforce, which in those years you would call it the masses, and design for them, make it accessible, this design. And I'll show some more people. Marcel Breuer or Klee, or the famous, in monk clothes, Itten, Johannes Itten, the Swiss guy who did the first year, and he, as you see, he was sort of dressed like a monk. He was a very interesting character, and this is Itten's color palette that he introduced. And here, you see, this is what happened to the Bauhaus in 1933. You can see there is paratroopers, Nazi paratroopers, and they've closed the place. And that is because you had there an avant-garde, and nobody liked avant-garde. It was threatening to traditional ways of thinking, and so this thing just got closed. And then after the war, they would have had a chance, one would have thought, because they were in East Germany, which was really under communist rule. And here you have a very wise man with lots of books that you all never read. Uncle Joe, as the Americans called him. And Uncle Joe left the Bauhaus, as a communist, of course, he left it to its materialist fate. And since they were always short of material, that's what they did to the Bauhaus. They just dismantled it and took off, you know, the iron cladding and just transported it elsewhere and got rid of that. Now, my argument, look at this. This is a book by Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman. It's about how you should interiorly furnish your house. And it goes along with this idea, my home is my castle. I mean, it's a book published in America, and it sort of thinks that living rooms should basically look like this. And the interesting thing about this, the Bauhaus was built in 1926, and this book was also published in 1926. And just to demonstrate the real difference of thinking how interiors should look like, here on the top you have the Mensa, as it is even today. Mensa meaning the dining room of the Bauhaus. And on the bottom you have a design by Gropius for an interior for the theater producer Erwin Piscator, who was stage setting many plays in Berlin in the 20s. Or you have furniture, Marcel Breuer, these chairs, you know them well. They all come from this Bauhaus Werkstatt, the workshop at the Bauhaus. And here, this is my argument about closing it. You have a completely different totalitarian, not individualistic regime on the top. Both pictures are from Nuremberg. One is from 1935, the party convention and the grounds designed by Albert Speer, Hitler's architect. And you can see that a single person doesn't count anything. It's just a mass. It's a very good demonstration in a space to kind of denigrate human, human individualism. There's the party with these flags, then there is all these masses equally dressed, not one bit of individuality, and then there's a couple of guys who kind of make the honneurs, you might say. And these couple of guys that made the honneurs there in 1946 were put on trial. This is the Nuremberg trial against Nazi crime, and most of them were hung. Now, a different piece of politics. Max Bill on your left and Tomás Maldonado on your right, an Argentinian theoretician on architecture, and Max Bill, the sculptor and a Bauhaus pupil, decided in 1958, I think, he was going to open the new Bauhaus. And his idea he could convey because he was politically linked with the sister of one of those Weiße Rose, White Rose, anti-Nazi demonstrators, young students who also got executed in 1943. His colleague, Otto Eicher, a graphic designer, was married to Inge Scholl, the sister of Sophie Scholl. I will just show that. And they And Max Bill got the approval of the government in Ulm. There you see Ulm with its cathedral, and on the bottom you see this new Bauhaus that Max Bill designed. Here you see the Scholl brother and sister who got executed in 1943 for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets in Munich University at the time. And what it brought was a completely different way of learning, because here you suddenly get sociology, politics, economics, philosophy, psychology, and then you have the design disciplines that also widen. It's no longer just architecture, painting, and so on. You have architecture, you have a basic course, which is something that they took from the Bauhaus, and you have architecture, urbanism, political methodology, media and television and radio. Then you have Werbung is advertising and information, photo, film. So the circle is much wider, and the scope of what they thought was teaching design suddenly widened a lot. And they also thought, and this has to do again with this picture from Nuremberg that I showed, they said this is a marching order, like what we're experiencing at the moment. The one blue guy at the front telling the rest what to do. It's not quite like that, but... And they said, this we don't want at all. What we want to learn in groups. 3 units. So you have teachers, these blue dots, with students around, and they all interact. It was really a different way of thinking how to learn together. And I just shortly show some products that you might know. This is Max Bill's famous kitchen clock and a radio recorder that he designed. Or Richard Zapper, these chairs, you know this stuff, I suppose. And they got that approved by the first president. This is the political story behind it. The first president of the German Republic after the war was Theodor Heuss, who was friends with the Scholl, and they gave him this money. But then times changed, and you get this guy called Filbinger to become the economics ministry in that part of in that province called Baden-Württemberg, which Ulm is part of. And he had a sort of very nice history. He was a judge under the Nazis, and 2 weeks before the end of the war, he condemned young deserters in the age of 20 to death. So he was a relentless guy, and of course these avant-gardists, they scared him to death. So what he did, he said, unfortunately I have to close this school because we're lacking 100,000 marks, 50,000 euro in your budget, and I can't find it anywhere, so I'm closing it. And this was in 1968. And this guy was this German student rebellion leader, Rudi Dutschke. He was like Danny the Red, but in Germany. And of course, 1968 saw other protests, and this scared this guy terribly, this Minister of Money, and he just couldn't, he was looking for any reason just to close the place. And he should have known better. Those are collages by John Hartfield saying that Hitler eats money and talks metal. He talks bullshit, but he gets money from industry and they support him. You see that? And here, this is interesting because the students are protesting outside the School of Ulm. They have 1943, which I mentioned, the Scholl sisters, 1968. Both, they say, are executions. And it's, they closed that school and that was it. It was a very well-known school, but it just got closed for political reasons. And now let me come to my other theme, which has to do what we are now doing with this kind of background in mind. Here you have Helmut Kohl in a photo montage. That's the blossoming landscapes that he promised us. And here is the Bauhaus as a part. I showed you what it was like under Stalin, and here is the Bauhaus suddenly a part of this blossoming landscape. And of course the question is, if you are working there and you are running a school, so what do you do? What kind of idea do you have? And we can't go back to using these places as workshops and just doing the the things that they did 80 or 90 years ago. So we had to kind of think something else. And we opened a thing that's called DIA, and the idea of DIA is dialogue, revitalizing the city. This was very much our theme. This is an old poster, you can see it was 2003. We have since broadened that, but let's see here. This is our campus. You see here the old Bauhaus. We occupy part of that, the rest is museum. And then we really have a campus, a school. The architecture building is 08. And that campus is new. Here are some photos of it. It's done by Professor Kister, a colleague of mine who's part of the staff in Dessau. And we asked ourselves 3 questions, and I will actually talk about that. Because we sort of looked, okay, you're training architects, how do we work like? What background material and knowledge do we need? It's a little bit like the questions in that Ulm circle, because I think again these kind of researches into what you need have changed, of course. And I will show 3 things. I thought that if you're in Dessau and you're part of this blossoming landscape, you ought to tackle projects that have a definitely historic context. And I will actually show 3 projects here that have been done in the school as studios. And the first one deals with history, right? And it's called the Berlin Wall Museum. It's by a student who actually left East Germany 3 weeks before it collapsed. So he kind of left early. He had a lot of trouble getting out, because afterward it turned easier. This is the day when, you know, the wall really fell. People just overcame that obstacle. But let's look at the basis of it. Here you see, this is the Cold War, Berlin being divided. You have East Germany, West Germany, you have the Soviet bloc in red, and you have the Western NATO allies in blue. And here you have some historic photos from that time. What happened? You had a war, you had Churchill doing victory, Roosevelt, and they kind of all convened in Berlin. And Berlin got cut up into 4 sectors, which you see on that side. There was a big Soviet chunk, and then the Western Allies occupied what was afterwards called West Berlin. And then you had a crisis, because the Russians in 1948 stopped all access roads to Berlin from the west. They were in position to do so, and you had to, because Berlin was like an island within the eastern, then to become German Democratic Republic, and you could only access it. There were feeder roads into that city, so the Russians closed the borders and said no go for about a year. And there was this Berlin airlift in 1948. Then again, in 1952, borders closed, because the East German government by then saw how many people were running away from there. And you can see, it was 1960, 200,000 people left the communist East. So there was all the reason to build a wall. And that's what they did in August 1961. You see, leaving Germany without permission is forbidden, and you get put in prison for 3 years if you do. And then Kennedy comes in 1961 to Berlin, and they kind of agree, okay, let's build this wall. We Americans are not going to make much of a fuss. And here it is. Here you see somebody running away, throwing away his gun to escape from the east as a soldier to the west. That's what it looked like. There you have the Brandenburg Gate, one of the kind of icons of Berlin. And here you have a technical kind of description what it was like. You had towers, you had a death strip, you had several, this wall was several walls. It wasn't just one big wall. That's what it looked like. And it went really quite across the city. And here you have, in 1989, on the 9th of November, you have the speaker of the communist government of East Berlin, and he gives a press conference, and that's the last day of Berlin Wall. That's him. Schabowski, his name was, Minister of Propaganda, and he declared the wall open, and he said, well, if you want to travel across, you can do so immediately. And that's what happened. People went on that wall, they greeted, the West, they really opened the wall, people would come through. This is an East German version of what you used to have called Susita. I don't know if people remember that, but it was a sort of plastic car. And here is the wall on your left, November 8th, and then on your right, November 9th. And this is the wall today. It's taken off completely, and you just have a kind of silent way of showing that it doesn't really exist anymore. It's gone away. And this wall was accompanied by some kind of terrible system of wall. Here you see the Ministry of State Security, it was called, which was nothing less than a kind of secret, like KGB police. It was called Stasi, and they would just listen to everybody. You see these guys with those tapes, and here you have other things. People run away, they break through metal fences, or they dig tunnels, like in the middle one, or they take a balloon, just to overcome this obstacle and go to the west. And it was really also a life between arms. It was very unpleasant. They wouldn't make halt to wall-in churches. Actually, this church, because it was obstructing the view, got just demolished and went away. And 170 people got shot trying to climb the wall or get out of it by some way. And here comes this student, Christian Kühne, who proposes, well, what shall we do? This wall, here he shows a city plan, ran right across the city and divided it completely. How can you make a kind of memory of that? And what do you memorize? So his argument is that you have, the Berlin Wall, and you have all these places that he picked where he thought he should put his museum. His idea was a traveling museum with all these artifacts that are terrible kitsch, actually. Those are sort of ceramics of the German Democratic Republic commemorating, communist ideas. You can see, he said all this stuff really, in one day became worth nothing and got put away, got put on heaps. And all those statues got dismantled. All the paraphernalia just in one day disappeared, more or less. And what he was suggesting is to build a kind of a rack where you can exhibit this thing, and it would travel throughout the city. So here you can see that, where he would put it. An example that we will see in a minute is the one that he put near Brandenburg Gate, because his museum was a kind of a gate too. So here is some more of that stuff. That's the location where he would put it. This is Brandenburg Gate. The wall is gone. That red thing, he sort of picked his locations where it should go. That's the design for it, what he was thinking that it should be. Here it is. And you can see how it works. It's a sort of rack that you can go up, and there are single cubicles that exhibit things. In that rack, and then you get an idea of what he wants to do there, and he constructs it. And that's what he thought it would be like. It's like two gates, right? The one that represents kind of freedom, and we got rid of all this, and the other thing is a kind of a gate that will tell you the story of, the kind of artifact that this regime would produce. The second thing I'm showing is a project that I did with students. It's in Frankfurt, that's my native city. And everybody, or I don't know, many people know this book. It's from Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, also from 1926, I believe, where he says where the modern stuff is lurking in the background. You can see that. You have all these Notre Dame and so on, Arc de Triomphe, in the front, the Paris City Hall on your far right. And then he says, we can do much better. We can do such an achievement of technology. This boat, kind of, you can pack all these buildings in there and forget about them. And it's of course a turning away from this kind of idea of a heritage. And here you are, this is Frankfurt city center, and there you have 3 points of interest. You have a big square called the Römer, and you have the Dome, and here you have the first place of a free German parliament from 1848, Paulskirche, St. Paul's Church. In this Römer building, the German kings and kaisers were elected until 1806, when Napoleon conquered Frankfurt. But before then, they were elected in this building and were taken on a procession route into the cathedral and then crowned. So this is a rather very important historic location, and this is what it looked like until 1944, and this is what it looked like after 1944, because it was heavily bombed and the whole thing was razed to the ground. These are already pictures where they started to make housing blocks here, because of course if the whole city is destroyed, then you really need to do something to build new housing. And you see here the Römer building, this medieval building, you see the cathedral, and all of this piece of city is just gone. And this is already in the 50s, and this is Paulskirche, and they constructed, you know, modern stuff on the top. But they really didn't know what to do, and they left it for a very long time as a parking lot. Then brutalism arrived, and they built the new technical city hall, which is this building here. This is from the 60s. You see here again the cathedral, the Römer building, the square. And then they had a competition in the 80s which added this. And this is one of the most important competitions of postmodern architecture around 85, that put a museum, which is this thing, it's an art museum, and each of the competitors that won a prize could build a little house. And you know, it is really a sort of postmodern collection of individual architecture worldwide. And Frankfurt, unfortunately or fortunately, is a very rich city. It's called Bankfurt because it not only developed this image, and you see here at the bottom again this technical city hall, it developed this. And you see Paulskirche, that thing, and the Römer is just behind here. It's not exactly on that photo. And the question was, well, what do you do if you decide to take down, which they have done, the technical city hall? They just went and demolished this building, got rid of it because they didn't like it. They always have the same argument. It's ridden with asbestos. It stood there for 40 years. Nothing ever happened to anybody, but then they had this idea, maybe they can find some asbestos, which is a very good reason to take down a building. And since it's a very wealthy city, they could afford to do so, and they just put it away. And then they opened up competitions of what to do, and they came up with ideas to continue this kind of tiki-taki houses, you know, and take old plans and do a redo from 1490 today, with houses that have a clear height per floor of 2 meters and 10, which are unrentable, but they don't care because they can afford it. And it's a kind of, you know, Frankfurt Disneyland copy of what one would do. And I asked the question, well, how do you tackle a thing like that? And here is a student, my Polish student, That's why he spells museum with a Z. And you see here the existing situation, these individual houses in the 80s, the museum there. You have Roman ruins here, you have the cathedral here. And she looked at the kind of typology of what was there before. It was narrow streets widening into plazas, and then she put modern uses like housing, officing, and so on in there. She also, because the city wants to build a new museum there, because they don't like the one that is here, they're taking this one down because it's also a beton brut building, and they hate it, and it doesn't fit their kind of image as this medieval beautiful place, so they're taking it off and they want to put it over there. So she did this design, and that's her proposal. And what I found interesting is that still she was talking not in this medieval language. I mean, that's what she took the typology of the city plan, but she did not implement a kind of architecture that was from 1490, which is, I think, impossible to do. So I'll just show those images. That's her proposal. Okay. So those are the two projects I was going to show that really dealt with history. Here we're talking about something else. We're talking about structure. And structure as a kind of biological a pattern, somewhere the argument is that these kind of structures on these animals that you see make some sense. They're not ornament, but they make camouflage, and they make reconnaissance among themselves, and so on. And that's the point of them. And if you look at them as patterns, you can also kind of do kind of experimentation, mathematical experimentation with it. And this is from Stephen Wolfgang's book, Another Kind of Science, where he demonstrates how you can use these things to kind of optimize such patterns. And here he just says, you know, if you run this through a computer, you'll just get an optimization of such patterning. And we had, for 4 years, we had Neil Leach teaching, and as under this heading of structure, I would like to show what he did in Amsterdam, where we were invited for the end of the year party of the academy in Amsterdam. And they have a very nice outside atrium where they were going to do a big party. And our students came there to design and build a pavilion for that party. And we supplied the workforce, and they supplied the material. The Dutch. They paid, you know, the wood and so on, and we came with the students and we built it. And here you see all the, you know, how they developed all the things. I mean, it's a sort of technological thing. But the interesting idea of this project really was that it was run, the design was completely run by a computer. They had Christina Scheer, the structural engineer at Cambridge University, come along and run the program and feed, you know, the parameters into the program. And it's a sort of design-build project, which was, of course, fascinating because usually these sort of blobologies that you get out of in these kind of designs, you can't build them, or it's very questionable how you build them. Here you could really, you had a product, you had a theory to it, how to get to this product, and in fact they, as it says, you know, generating forms, merging computer generative technologies with design in landscape architecture, hardscape, and topology generation. You had this court, that's the orange square. You had this court of the school, and then you put this kind of pavilion into it. And here you see during the construction phase what they did. how they laid out those buttons on the ground, constructed them, put it together.
How long was the workshop?
It was 10 days.
And what is the cladding? Is also wood?
No, the skin is a plastic material. That's you can see. I don't have any pictures of the party, unfortunately, because the pictures were taken by Neil Leach, and I don't think he could take pictures when he was finished with the party. And he was amazing, because Neil would come, the students loved him, because every week that he came he had a party. And he had all kinds of, we have a lot of Polish and Russian students, so he had every time a different brand of vodka. It was very interesting anyway. So, but he's gone, so for anybody that wants to come to learn how to drink is finished. He taught you that, but it's finished. So here is another thing that we do a lot, parametric design. And this is from a book that I bought when I was a student. How does actually, it's a sort of design analysis if you really sort of go by parameters. How do you start? You have an idea. You need something. You have an idea how to do it. You analyze it. You get some results. You evaluate your results. You change these things, and you have a new hypothesis. In some way, it is that which I showed with the patterns, where somebody makes an algorithm to optimize this way of thinking, which this is just a kind of diagram about that. And this again is a kind of decision tree, you might call it, how you get to some design decision. Most of you, or I hope, have read Christopher Alexander's book, Notes on the Synthesis of Design, which talks about that at a very, very early stage, 35, 40 years ago, talking that you can think mathematically to come to the optimal solution. And here is the same book that I bought in 1970. This is GM being very proud to produce the first computer-designed cars. And if you look at that thing, you really think, what? They need, what do they need all these Frigidairs for? What is this? We have this machine today, and we don't need all this kind of electronic rubbish that is inside it. But that's how technology really has changed over the last 30 years. And I believe you might look at the world as really a digital product. And this is what this is about. And this project that I'm showing is, I think, the last project that I will show. It is in Hong Kong, and it shows the normal building of a skyscraper. Here is our site, and this site then gets built on. Let's see, I don't have to say anything, which runs itself. Here is your plot. You have a couple of parameters, best views, winds. You adjust it to the plot site. You adjust it to views. And then you swirl, and you optimize those ellipses as swirls. You pick a height. What's the optimum height in Hong Kong? You have volumes that are not affected by rotation, and those are cores, those volumes. Then you have a parameter, maximum evacuation distance. You put it in. You have the cores within that building. You have to have a disposition because of security concerns, and there you have a volume that you construct with cores inside. Then you make a surface. What do you do there? You make a structural tiling system and the membrane, and this is the old way to make something like that, he says. You make layers to do certain jobs. And he says you can do this much better and use geometry to generate this. These are the tiles on your surface, and you use them to be intelligent tiles to protect against for shading and so on. You can do all these things. That's how he generated this project. You make a real facade with that, and then this facade is intelligent. This pattern gets information. The pattern is information. You see the cell, and there you have receptacles or receptors that will gather information. It's almost like a brain. It will then send it to a central point that will process this information and resend it, and then this whole element is going to react onto these kind of informations that it got. And then you see the position of these individual pieces changing again through the information they get. And here is then the building, how it responds to various interactions with the nature. And that would be the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Okay.
Questions on it?
I have one. How can you open this one? Okay.
תפתח, בבקשה.
I'm interested in you separated the three contexts.
Yeah.
One can interpret the second context as an historical. What is the fusion of those contexts? Did you deal with trying to fuse, let's say, parametric design with historical context or something like this?
I think that if you design, I mean, from the set, if you start designing in a non-Euclidean context, in a non-90-degree, three-dimensional context, you are actually using parametrics because it becomes so complicated that you better do that in order not to have to work it out all by yourself. You can take, for instance, Frei Otto's free structures in Munich as a tensile thing. They had to work out each load and so on. It was very, very difficult because they didn't have this machine to help. So I think that, you know, to use computer programming in design is not a separate, it's not a separate entity of use. It's just an intelligent way of solving a problem, I believe. And that's why I said if you do these blobobics, you know, these kind of funny blobs, I tend to question that because it suddenly goes off in a spin by itself and it loses its own context, I believe. However, I don't think, you know, the thing in Amsterdam was really a design-build project. The court, yes, is a historic court, and maybe what you might say is the juxtaposition of what we built there that we didn't go and do Frankfurt and build, you know, in the context, build these kind of typological forms, but rather generated a form through an algorithmic process and then built it. And I think that's, if you know, Rivka and Robert Oxman have just produced this book, New Structuralism. If you look at that, you will see that that's what they're after. Something that is buildable, not just sort of a fantasizing product of a possibility that a computer can do. And I think, you know, coming from this context where Audi will make an advertisement saying Vorsprung durch Technik, which means advantage through technology, and that's a sort of very German belief. I mean, that's the only it's the only thing they have to sell, I think. They don't have any oil, they have nothing like that. They just have technology as a sort of generative tool. And I think those last two contexts that I showed had something to do with that. And they are just, what I was trying to demonstrate is that if you're faced with the Frankfurt city government wanting to take down a building because they think it's freaking ugly, then you have to have a sort of different methodology to approach this project, and it will involve you reading very much more about history than knowing grasshopper or rhino. That won't help you too much in that context, because you have to understand why it all happened and why it looks today like it looks. So my idea to answer your question is that you just have to kind of have different knowledges as an architect to kind of feel comfortable to find solutions in a certain place. That's really what my answer is. And the fusion, yes, again, that's why I said first, if you start designing something that has a complex geometry, you're anyway there. You have to use that. But that's, you know, it's also, of course, a sort of answer about, well, what do you think about historicism? Building, you know, rebuilding heritage and rebuilding buildings that have been disappeared 500 years, and how do we go about that? How do we classify these things? I think it's a relevant argument today, because if you look, what we as trained architects get as jobs, and then what developers put into the landscape, there is really, it's going like that. And I believe our power of convincing a public is diminishing, because we are not the guys with the money. We are, you know, the sort of servants, and you are, you know, if talking about historicism, I can just say that I really believe that bad taste never went out of style, you know. And yeah, that's what our built environment to a large extent looks like. And you can moralize about that, but what I think that young people should learn is in some way, you would call these things design tactics. To be able to know, how can I get this across to my client? What is this about? You know, is it about making just a design-sensitive skin like the last one, or is it you're taking down half of a square that was bombed anyway, and it has a certain history? So what do you do in that situation? If you come along and you say, that's what the Frankfurt politicians want to do, let's take out the plans from 500 years ago and rebuild this slum. This beautiful stuff. Because it was a slum, of course. It was a slum until 1944. It was a terrible place to live. It was overcrowded. There was no. It was all those things that modern architecture always complained about. So it's, of course, also how do you deal with your own heritage? How do you treat that? And of course, in Germany, this question is a very delicate one. Warsaw was bombed to the ground. There was nothing left. The Polish said, we're not going to be eradicated by this Nazi kind of ideology. We're going to rebuild exactly our city, as if nothing happened. But then, if you do this in Germany and say, as if nothing happened, what does that mean? You can't say that. And I faced this problem actually also quite a bit when doing synagogues in Germany. I once did a lecture, I remember, in San Francisco, and there was an old emigre from Germany who told me, none of your buildings look like these nice synagogues that we used to have. And I said, well, you can't do that. And he said, well, Bob Stern built one in New York. I said, yeah, but that's New York.
And that's Bob Stern.
Yeah, and it's Bob Stern. But Bob Stern actually argues that, you know, the Jerusalem seminar, he was there a couple of years ago, and he said that all his buildings were very modern because they were all air conditioned. They all had air conditioning. I mean, he has a good sense of humor. But, you know, and I answered this guy with a joke. I said, look, if you're in this kind of situation, then imagine in 1939, somebody who just emigrated from Germany meets his friend in New York, who has been there since 1933. And he takes him home. This guy said, I'm already established, I've been here a couple of years, I'm doing fine. Come to my house. And in his living room, he has a more than life-size portrait of Adolf Hitler. And this other guy said, are you crazy? That's what I've just been running away from. You know what it's like? It's terrible. What are you putting this for? And he says, that's against homesickness. And in some way, that makes this point that you can't, you know, in some instances, you just can't go back. It just doesn't. And then you have to sort of use, I think, different techniques than if you just were faced with designing a pavilion for a day. You know, it's just very different. And I don't know if that guy got convinced by that joke, but because, you know, he might have thought I had been to his apartment. But you don't know. But anyway, I think there is this sort of romanticism about the old stuff that is, that in some way it's fair, in some way it makes a lot of sense. But you have to just inspect on the ground what it is. I mean, to be very critical, I would say that in Israel at the moment there is this argument on heritage is something that is used politically. Look at Kever Rachel. I mean, go there. Have you been there? You like that place? Very nice. Yeah, go there. You know, it's this sort of thing where, you know, one might question, you know, why are they using architecture for this means? And you have to kind of have your own way to think about these things. And I think this is why I also showed those pictures of the wall and so on. What was this like? What's it like to live on one side, and what's it like to live on the other side?
You say that's because the kever is something not nice because of the wall?
I think that the environs...
The architecture by itself, there is a problem over there.
Yeah, I know. They're saying it should be a mosque, and they're having an argument. Yeah, but I'm not saying that this is not... What I'm saying is, here in this political situation, I think that architecture on either side of the conflict parties is used in a non-architectural way at all. It's not about use, it's not about living in that thing, it's anyway for dead people. But, you know, it's none of this. And the argument, of course, is that you have to... I was just in this conference in Jerusalem, and I must say that, you know, what UNESCO does for heritage work, I'm really, really critical of that. Because in some way, what they have done is they have made a catalogue of well-behaved ways, and they come to you, they go to Angkor Wat, and they say, well, this thing, yes, it qualifies, but you have to do A, B, C, and D. Then we might give you some money. It's funny, because that is using architecture in a very strange...
They don't have money.
Well, they give you money, for instance, in Sana'a in Yemen. They reconstructed the whole infrastructure, all the sewage and so on in the city. They will do that, but I mean, here they won't, and in Europe they don't invest. But they take away, like Dresden used to be a World Heritage Site. They decide to build a bridge which they think is not right, so they take this title away, and it's a big political argument, you know. Because the Germans sort of feel, once again, we get kicked in the pants for being the bad guys. You know, we're doing always the wrong thing, and so on. But it's less that. It's more, you know, I think there is, behind it all, there is a theoretical debate that needs to be debated, and I think it's an important thing that the school should provide such a debate. And I think we do that. I mean, we have people in the school teaching theory that are, I think, relevant theoreticians. And we have parametric designers that are interesting parametric designers. But my point is that you don't go into a direction where it's a one-way street. Like, if you go to the AA today, I think that school is a one-way street. It's very successful. But it tells you can do parametric urbanism, which I believe you can't do at all. You can't do that. It's, you know, it's kind of really talking to you about what should you be taught. So maybe I'm really addressing the wrong kind of public, because you're sitting there and say, what is this guy telling us? We don't know what they should teach us. They're teaching us, right? But there is a kind of critical moment in that you should be asking yourself, because if you are given a problem, you have to sit down and say, well, what is this problem about? What is in this problem that is looking for a solution? What is relevant and what is completely irrelevant? You know, it's for you maybe kind of choosing the sort of door handles. I mean, if that's what this project is about, then, you know, it has to really be about that. I mean, as an anecdote, I can just tell you that I studied my first degree in England, in Cambridge, and they never taught us to construct anything. You know, it was all design. And I came to the Swiss Federal Polytechnical Institute, called ETH, and I showed my work, and they looked at it, and the only comment they made was, you know what, all your doors are opening the wrong way. That was the only critique I got on my design. So I thought, boy, I've come to a different place. They really want something else here. So that's really what I was trying to show in my lectures, you know, how to open these doors. Do you have any other questions? Or? Yeah. I know. It's of course political. That's the point.
How can it not be?
Well, I don't want to argue about that, but I mean, what I know, you mean push, for instance.
No, it doesn't mean about push. It means that it's not political, but obviously it is. I mean,
well, I don't want to start an argument here. You can do that by yourself. I just no. What I meant was that, in fact, the project of modernism, yes, which showed Corbusier's Aquitania in front with these old buildings. And if you know his projects, he was ready to just take off half of Paris. He said, goodbye, plan voisin, we don't need this one. This is no good. This kind of radical project today gets in some, I mean, I believe that heritage is actually an invention of modernism, interestingly. You know, without a modernist project, you don't bother about heritage, because it's a reaction to the sort of, we don't want to have anything to do with this historical context.
so let's save it.
So let's save it. Come afterwards, after 30, 40 years, come people and say, look, I mean, it's terrible. These modern cities, they're horrible. And let's go back on that.
But then exactly the project that you described, showing, for example, the pavilion in the courtyard, you know, that was exactly a moment where the project could evolve actually and realize its location and generate understanding of the relationship between the structure, computer-generated project for its own merit and the courtyard itself, and you know,
that's this fusion of context,
right? And you know, that was exactly a moment where I was trying to see if that's going to happen. But maybe you mentioned, I think it was a 10-day course, so that was very short.
It was very short.
Yeah.
But it was, I mean, it makes a point, that thing, you know. It makes this point that, you know, I don't know, have you ever heard Carl Chu lecture?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
How long did it take? 3 hours or 4?
I didn't hear about it.
I just walked up. It's you know, that's well, it's dangerous stuff. You know, that stuff is real dangerous to go into the genetics of architecture and things like that. But anyway, I think that, you know, at the end of the day, this stuff is only a product of that machine, and it's not really implementable. And I'm more interested in things that you can actually put it to use. Then it makes to me a lot of sense. I mean, there is a lot of building projects that have been done that need the assistance of this intelligent way of construction. I mean, what's his name? Ron Arad built a shopping center in England where he needed this badly, and the engineers, I talked to these engineers, and you know, he really needs the expertise of these engineers to come to these results of his building, because if he doesn't have them, he doesn't know how to do it. Or the swimming pavilion in Beijing, without engineers, forget it. So it's a fusion of intelligence and, in some way, perhaps also a comment, a historic comment, on what had happened maybe 150 years ago, when the architects would build the railway station facade. It looked like a castle, and then came the engineers who did the smart stuff inside, so that the trains could go. You know, there was a total division, and I think at one point we were at this point. You know, with themes like I don't know, critical regionalism, and all the postmodern debate on typologies and forms and so on. And I think it's swinging back to a kind of intelligence and an engineering intelligence that you need. And this is what I was trying to show. I mean, if you like, even the Frankfurt project, which is a couple of years old, it had this kind of deconstructive constructivism. I mean, these pieces that would uphold the structures and so on. But it also concerned itself with the typology of the city. And it would just say, okay, what was this like? It had narrow streets, it had nice little piazzas. Let's maybe develop a kind of tissue that does this, but not copy it completely. That was the point.
Okay, thank you very much, Alfred. טוב.
Strange. 1 year ago, I went to one of my family did the Brit Mila, her son. They live in Hebron. They are not religious, from the hardcore of the settlements over there. And it was after, I think, kind of never been there. Yeah, basically, I think that maybe I was there when I was a kid. And the first thing I was, I saw my mom. Where's the tomb? We came here for the tomb Alfred, and in my eyes, my vision was this little tomb as we see on all the synagogues, in the vitrage, and all what you see, and we never see this. And I think that was the only thing that was bothering me as an architect. That you cannot see the tomb. It was there. It was the wall, it was all over the wall. And then when you get inside, in this specific moment, they didn't even give you to get